Morning. So, big controversial question for the day. Is there a God? Big topic, right? And my perspective on that has certainly changed over the years. Always a tricky subject when you start talking to people about deeply and profoundly held religious beliefs, right? Because the concept of belief is not always grounded in facts and logic, right? It can be, and certainly there's a lot of people through, the centuries who have tried to create some sort of, logical framework for the existence of the idea of a God. But ultimately, what it comes down to for a lot of people, as far as my observations take me, is subjective experience, right? There's something about life and their experience that leads them to believe that there's a God of some sort. Now, there tends to be a really tight correlation between where you were born and what sort of God you believe in, right? I mean, there aren't a whole lot of Christians in India. They tend to be, Hindu or, maybe Buddhist or Muslim, but not a whole lot of Christians, which isn't to say they're not there, but, there's certainly an aspect to faith that is passed on by tradition from parents to children, right? And so it's really sticky to kind of, challenge or push back on those notions when so much of a person's fundamental idea of who they are and how they understand the world is really bound up in this idea of the divine. So for me to even start to unpack this, you kind of have to define your terms. When we say God, at least in the Western world, we're talking about the sort of Judeo-Christian concept or the biblical concept of God, right? Which is sort of, this omnipotent, omniscient, bearded figure who resides in the heavens somewhere above us. And the more specifically you define what that entity is, the harder it becomes to, really substantiate logically whether such, an entity exists beyond the just subjective experience. And I don't want to totally invalidate the subjective experience. I want to kind of remain sensitive to those subjective concepts of, divinity, because they're personal, they're internal, right? And for me to say, no, that's not true, that didn't happen to you, that's not real. I mean, who am I to crawl inside your head, right? But if we're going to agree on the existence of something, either I have to have a similar subjective experience, or you've got to, point to something concrete outside yourself that we can both kind of define clearly what those things mean, and come to agreement or disagreement about the factual reality of the thing, right? So definitions vary, right? I mean, you get into the very specific, biblical God, and there's all sorts of internal inconsistencies that can be pointed to. Again, the more specifically you try to define that entity, and it can range from that all the way to the incredibly nebulous, higher power, quote unquote, which could be anything, right? And so I think that's a good place to start, right? I mean, is there something out there beyond ourselves? And if you're going to assert that something exists, the burden of proof is on you, right? If you want to assert there's in the kind of one of the classic examples is a tea kettle orbiting Jupiter, right? The burden of proof is on you to prove that that tea kettle is out there in orbit, right? It is not incumbent upon me, the person you're trying to persuade into believing that is factually true, right? It's not on me to disprove your assertion, right? Or to prove the negative, that there is no teapot orbiting Jupiter. Now, I mean, I can go study and research and try and find your teapot and might conclude that there's no evidence supporting that assertion. But, I mean, I don't have to do that, right? If you're going to say it's there, you're going to have to cite more than your subjective experience, right? So if we're going to say, is there something, a higher power outside ourselves? If you get that vague and nebulous, I mean, it's impossible to prove the negative, right? And say it's not out there, right? The vastness of the universe. I mean, I talked, in the last video just about, whether or not we're in a simulation, multiverse, and, again, I mean, if we're in a simulation, is the operating system we're running on, is that God? I mean, it's certainly a higher power. It might qualify under that definition, right? Or, any sufficiently advanced, civilization that's kind of surpassed the constraints of corporeal reality and can transit through, time and dimension. I mean, it's certainly a higher power. Is it a deity in the classical sense? Probably not, right? I mean, they were something akin to maybe a corporeal being at one time, and they've maybe evolved past that and are, super powerful and super knowledgeable, but maybe lack the sort of biblical omnipotence, omniscience of the biblical deity, right? That is to say, like, it's possible to know much of what there is to know in the universe. It's possible to be able to do much of what is theoretically possible, but to say that you are all-powerful or all-knowing is an internally inconsistent idea, right? I mean, it's sort of that, can God create a boulder heavier than he can pick up, right? Or can God microwave a burrito hotter than he can eat, right? And when you say all-powerful, right, nothing is impossible, can, the logical bounds of that statement start to break down just with the extremity of it. But if you want to say that there's some uber powerful entity out there that can do basically anything, or anything theoretically possible, or can know anything that's theoretically knowable, well, is that a deity? I mean, certainly our cave-dwelling ancestors would have thought so. You get into ancient alien theory and stuff like that, I mean, maybe that's what maybe that's what they were seeing and talking about, and things like Ezekiel's wheel. If you read that, I mean, it sounds an awful lot like a UFO, right? I mean, there's nothing to those ancient alien theorist ideas, or Eric von Däniken's Chariots of the Gods. I mean, I think there's on the basic level, the premise has merit, even though the evidence they point to is certainly shaky and maybe has more plausible explanations. But to kind of circle back again, so it's certainly possible there's something out there beyond ourselves, right? Now, whether that has any ultimate bearing on our existence or meaning for our existence, I mean, again, with something that broad, it's really impossible to say, but it's not apparent, right? If there's just some super powerful, millions of years old, incorporeal being out there, do they really notice or care that way? I mean, they might be aware of our existence. Do they have any, emotional or personal investment in our existence? Possibly. Maybe it's just mild curiosity, the way a kid looks at his ant farm, right? And nothing more than that. But that's not really what people mean when they say, is there a God, right? and to get into kind of more concrete terms, right? The notion of the divine and, the afterlife and heaven or hell, I mean, it has connotations about the nature of existence beyond our immediate physical existence, right? And it begs the question, the metaphysical question, what are we fundamentally, right? Are we just a collection of atoms existing in sort of a Newtonian, billiard ball state where one reaction leads to another? Or are we more than the sum of our parts? Where do, consciousness and thoughts arise from? Do you call that the soul or the spirit? And is there something tangible, maybe, beyond our, crude matter that persists beyond us when life ends, right? And I think that's a lot of where these notions were sort of birthed from, right? As humans became sentient, we certainly noticed that things are transient, right? That there is a cycle of birth and death, right? And that eventually who we are will end, and there's nothing obvious of us that persists beyond that. And so by extension, right, if you're going to assert that, well, we do have a soul or a spirit, where does that ultimately come from? Then that sort of naturally leads to this idea of God, and especially when you have, again, our more primitive ancestors witnessing sort of, unexplainable, dramatic phenomena like lightning in the sky, and wondering, what that is. Or seeing the stars far above us and having just no clue what it was they were looking at. You could see how that would lend itself to notions of, super powerful beings, that are far beyond us and live somewhere above us, right? And then as we became more complex in our thinking, in the abstract, and again, being aware of this cycle of birth and death, it again lends one to ask, where did it all come from? And that's a very deep and profound question that we don't really have a great answer to at this point. We can look at space and see matter and energy accelerating away from, maybe a more dense, hot state. And so we've got this idea of, the Big Bang, right, where everything was kind of closer to the form of a singularity and then expanded suddenly and violently outward. But that's not really a satisfying answer to, an intelligent ape like us that sees, meaning in the world, or at least creates meaning in the world, and asks questions like why, right? And why is any of this here? And just to say, well, because, matter and energy expanded is not a satisfying answer. And doesn't really drive at the root of what the question means, right? Metaphysically, is there anything more than what we see, and how did it get here? And so, again, you answer that question by saying, well, just like we create meaning in the world, there's something greater, more wise, and more powerful than us that created all around us and created it for a purpose. Or so the thinking goes. And again, I am not convinced that there's evidence to support that, but even then, right, it's kind of an unknowable question, right? And if you're going to assert that, the burden of proof is on you, right? Demonstrate for me concretely why that is true beyond your own subjective experience, which I lack. And if you can't, then it's not on me to prove a negative and say that thing is not there. I'm just going to presume that since I have not perceived it, it is not there, because I don't see any real evidence for it. Which isn't to say it couldn't be there, But, if it's that hard to nail down, then, how real is it, right? If there was some being that created all of this and has an active interest in everything, you would unambiguously, it would seem, or you would think, see that entity's hand in everything. And there's certainly those that would point to everything being, the hand of God. But there's ambiguity there, right? Those observations are subject to interpretation. And biblically speaking, the counter to that would be, God created us with free will, and He wants to give us the freedom of choice, and making it unambiguous makes choice impossible. And I don't buy that argument, right? I talked previously about how we know what we ought to do and we don't do it, right? And if everybody knew that the literal biblical God and was real, and that Jesus was His Son, and everybody just knew unambiguously that was true, and that if they didn't accept Jesus into their hearts, they would burn in eternal torment, I think you would still have people who chose to reject that, and who would, for whatever reason, choose eternal torment, because that's just how contrarian humans seem to be. And then, of course, if that omnipotent being is real, why did He create beings that act that way, right? And is that really their fault if that's how they were made and they behave the way they were designed? Right? So, and I don't really want to get too into the weeds about Christian apologetics specifically, because frankly the subject's not that interesting to me anymore. And there was a time when I wrestled really actively with that stuff and fought against it and pushed hard against it. But ultimately, I've made my peace with it, as far as it being an aspect of our lives and our culture, for better or for worse. And I'm not trying to dump on Christianity. I've got an affinity for it. Maybe just because how I was raised, and that's how culture works. Nevertheless, I don't think it's invaluable. But if you're just asking the broader philosophical question, I find it lacking. But that's just my perspective, and it's about as valid as anybody else's. But hey, that's why you're here. You just want to listen to me ramble on about things I don't know about, right? Anyway, I continue to be tickled and delighted that anybody spends any amount of time listening to just kind of my unfiltered thoughts on these things. So thanks for tuning in, those of you who do. And please do feel free to engage. Drop a comment below. Let me know what you think. And we can go rounds about it in the comment section, or I can make a further video if you find something interesting. If you're enjoying it, please do hit the like button, because not like I've got huge aspirations for this, but reaching a wider audience I think would be fun, at least for me. And if you like what I'm saying, feel free to share it around, and get other people involved in the conversation. Let me know what you think. It's been fun. See you in the next one.